The medical conference room buzzed with quiet conversation as doctors and nurses filled the chairs around the large oval table. Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her white coat and glanced at her notes one final time. Today's presentation was supposed to be routine, a discussion about battlefield medicine techniques that could be applied in civilian hospitals. She had volunteered to speak, though her colleagues knew little about why she was so passionate about trauma care. Sarah stood at the front of the room, her petite frame dwarfed by the large projection screen behind her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her hands rested calmly at her sides. To most people in the room, she looked like any other dedicated physician who had spent years studying medicine in prestigious universities. "Good morning, everyone," Sarah began, her voice steady and professional. "Today, I want to talk about rapid trauma assessment and the critical decisions we make in the first few minutes of treating severe injuries." Dr. Martinez, the head of emergency medicine, leaned forward in his chair. He had worked with Sarah for 3 years and had always been impressed by her calm demeanor during the most chaotic situations. Whether it was a car accident victim with multiple injuries or a shooting victim bleeding out on the table, Sarah never seemed to panic. Her hands never shook, and her voice never wavered. Sarah clicked to her first slide, which showed a diagram of the human torso with major organs highlighted. When someone comes through our doors with traumatic injuries, we have what I call the golden hour. But in reality, the most critical decisions happen in the first 10 minutes. A young resident named Dr. Kim raised her hand. "Dr. Chen, how do you stay so calm during trauma situations? I've seen you work, and you never seem rattled, even when things get really bad." Sarah paused for a moment, her fingers unconsciously touching a small scar on her left wrist that was barely visible beneath her sleeve. "Experience," she said simply. "The more you see, the better you become at prioritizing what needs immediate attention." She clicked to the next slide, which showed a photo of a field hospital tent. "Some of the techniques I'm going to show you today were developed in environments where resources were limited and time was even more precious than it is here." Dr. Rodriguez, a veteran surgeon who had served in Vietnam decades earlier, studied the photo carefully. Something about the way Sarah spoke, the specific details she mentioned, made him wonder about her background. He had tried to look up her military service record once, curious about where she had learned such advanced trauma techniques, but had found nothing in the usual databases. "Dr. Chen," Dr. Rodriguez said, "where exactly did you train in battlefield medicine? Your techniques are incredibly advanced." Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Various medical missions," she replied, moving quickly to the next slide. "The important thing is adapting these techniques to our environment here." The presentation continued with Sarah demonstrating various procedures on medical mannequins. She showed how to quickly assess internal bleeding, how to stabilize spinal injuries when time was critical, and how to make life or death decisions about which patients to treat first when multiple casualties arrived simultaneously. Dr. Williams, a trauma nurse with 15 years of experience, watched Sarah's hands as she demonstrated a complex suturing technique. The movements were too precise, too automatic. These weren't skills learned in a classroom or even a regular hospital rotation. These were skills carved into muscle memory through repetition under pressure. "The key to managing multiple trauma patients," Sarah explained, "is something called triage. You have to make quick decisions about who you can save, who will survive without immediate intervention, and who." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "Who is beyond help." The room had grown quieter as Sarah spoke. There was something in her tone, a weight behind her words that suggested personal experience rather than textbook knowledge. Dr. Martinez noticed that Sarah's left hand had a slight tremor when she wasn't actively using it. He had seen that before in colleagues who had worked in war zones, but Sarah's personnel file listed her as having gone straight from medical school to residency to their hospital. There was no mention of military service or overseas medical missions. As Sarah demonstrated how to quickly establish an airway in a patient with severe facial trauma, her movements became more intense. She worked with an urgency that seemed disproportionate to the training scenario. Speed is everything, she said, her voice taking on a different quality. When you're working and you can hear. She stopped abruptly, realizing she had been about to say something she hadn't intended to share. Hear what? Dr. Kim asked innocently. Sarah looked down at the medical mannequin, her composure faltering for just a moment. When you can hear the sounds of chaos around you. Sirens, shouts, equipment alarms. You have to block it all out and focus on the person in front of you. But several people in the room had caught the hesitation. It sounded like she had been about to say something else entirely. Dr. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah more carefully. Her posture, the way she carried herself, the automatic scanning of the room she did whenever she entered a space. These were habits he recognized from his own military service decades ago. The presentation moved into its final section, where Sarah discussed psychological care for trauma patients. Many people who survive serious injuries suffer from PTSD, she explained. The physical wounds heal, but the mental ones can last much longer. As she spoke about PTSD symptoms, her voice became softer, more personal. Survivors often experience flashbacks, difficulty sleeping, hypervigilance, and emotional numbness. They might avoid situations that remind them of their trauma. Dr. Williams noticed that Sarah's hand had moved unconsciously to her shoulder, where the edge of what looked like another scar was just barely visible above her collar. The most important thing, Sarah continued, is creating an environment where survivors feel safe to share their experiences. Many of them have been through things that are difficult for others to understand or believe. The room was completely silent now. Everyone could sense that Sarah was speaking from a place of deep, personal knowledge. Dr. Martinez found himself wondering about the gaps in Sarah's file, about her unusual expertise, about the way she sometimes seemed to be somewhere else entirely during quiet moments at the hospital. As Sarah concluded her presentation, she looked around the room at her colleagues. For 3 years, she had worked alongside these people, saving lives and sharing the daily struggles of emergency medicine. But there was so much about herself that she had never shared. So much they didn't know. Are there any final questions? She asked. Dr. Kim raised her hand again. Dr. Chen, you seem to know so much about trauma and PTSD. Have you worked with a lot of veterans? Sarah's eyes met Dr. Kim's, and for a moment, something flickered across her face, a vulnerability that she quickly masked. Yes, she said quietly. I've worked with veterans. What she didn't say was that she was one herself. What she didn't tell them was about the 8 years she had spent as a Navy SEAL medic, about the classified missions in places whose names she couldn't mention, about the teammates she had saved and the ones she had lost. As the meeting ended and people filed out of the room, Sarah remained standing at the front, staring at the projection screen that now showed only a blank blue background. Her carefully constructed civilian life felt suddenly fragile, like a thin shell that could crack at any moment. Dr. Martinez approached her as she packed up her materials. Sarah, that was an incredible presentation. Your knowledge of trauma medicine is really remarkable. Thank you, she replied, not meeting his eyes. If you ever want to talk, he said gently, about anything, I'm here. Sometimes it helps to share experiences with people who might understand. Sarah looked up at him sharply. Did he suspect something? Had she revealed too much during her presentation? I appreciate that, she said carefully, but I'm fine. As Dr. Martinez left, Sarah was alone in the conference room. She walked over to the window and looked out at the busy street below. Normal people going about their normal lives, unaware of the wars being fought in distant places, unaware of the sacrifices made by people like her to keep them safe. She touched the scar on her wrist again, remembering the day she had gotten it. The day everything changed. The day that led her to leave the only life she had known for 8 years and try to rebuild herself as someone completely different. But secrets had a way of surfacing, especially in a place like a hospital, where people were trained to observe and ask questions. Sarah had a feeling that her carefully maintained cover was beginning to crack, and she wasn't sure she was ready for what might happen when the truth finally came out. 3 weeks after the medical conference, Sarah was working a night shift in the emergency department when everything changed. It was 2:30 a.m., and the hospital had been relatively quiet when the ambulances started arriving. A multi-car accident on the highway had created a mass casualty situation that pushed every staff member to their limits. Sarah moved between patients with practiced efficiency, her training taking over as she assessed injuries and directed treatment. The chaos of the emergency room, the shouting nurses, the beeping monitors, the controlled urgency of life-saving work felt familiar in a way that civilian life never quite had. Dr. Williams was struggling with a patient who had severe abdominal trauma when she called out, "Sarah, I need help over here. This guy is bleeding internally, and I can't get a clear view of the damage." Sarah hurried over and looked at the patient, a young man probably in his 20s with multiple lacerations and signs of internal bleeding. Without hesitation, she began working, her hands moving with a precision that came from years of practice under the worst possible conditions. "We need to get him to surgery now," Sarah said. "But first we have to stabilize the bleeding." She reached for instruments and began a procedure that Dr. Williams had never seen performed outside of an operating room. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Dr. Williams asked, watching in amazement as Sarah's hands seemed to know exactly where to go and what to do. "Emergency field surgery," Sarah replied automatically, then caught herself. "I mean, advanced trauma stabilization," but Dr. Williams was paying attention now. The technique Sarah was using, the speed and confidence of her movements, the way she seemed to anticipate complications before they happened. This wasn't normal emergency medicine training. As Sarah worked, she began giving quiet instructions to the nurses around her. "I need 2 units of O-negative blood, stat. Get me a surgical kit, not the standard trauma kit. And someone needs to call the surgeon and tell him we're coming up with a patient who has a severed hepatic artery." Dr. Williams stared at her. "How do you know it's the hepatic artery? The ultrasound results aren't back yet." Sarah paused, her hands still working inside the patient's abdomen. "I can feel it," she said simply. 20 minutes later, they had stabilized the patient enough to get him to surgery. As they wheeled him away, the surgeon stopped to talk to Sarah. "Dr. Chen, whatever you did down there saved his life. That was some of the best field surgery I've ever seen. Where did you learn to do that?" Sarah pulled off her bloody gloves and avoided the surgeon's eyes. "Just experience," she said. But Dr. Williams wasn't satisfied with that answer. As the night continued and more patients arrived, she watched Sarah work with growing curiosity and concern. There were too many small things that didn't add up. The way Sarah automatically checked for exit wounds when treating what appeared to be simple injuries. The way she seemed to expect the worst-case scenario in every situation. The way she could identify the sound of different types of medical equipment without looking. Most telling of all was an incident that happened around 4 a.m. A patient came in complaining of severe headaches and disorientation. As Sarah was examining him, a piece of equipment in the next bay suddenly malfunctioned, creating a loud popping sound, followed by a harsh electrical buzzing. Sarah's reaction was instantaneous and extreme. She dropped to the floor, pulling the patient down with her, her body covering his protectively. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning for threats, and her breathing became rapid and shallow. "Sarah!" Dr. Williams called out, rushing over. "What's wrong?" It took several seconds before Sarah seemed to realize where she was. She slowly stood up, her face flushed with embarrassment and something else. Fear. "I'm sorry," she said, helping the patient back onto the examination table. "I thought." The sound startled me. But Dr. Williams had seen that reaction before. Her brother had come back from Iraq with PTSD, and she recognized the signs of a flashback when she saw one. The rest of the night passed without incident, but Dr. Williams couldn't stop thinking about what she had witnessed. When their shift ended at 6 a.m., she found Sarah in the break room, staring out the window at the sunrise. "Sarah, can we talk?" Dr. Williams asked gently. Sarah tensed. "About tonight. About some things I've been noticing." Dr. Williams sat down across from her. "I think you've been through something that you haven't told anyone about." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "We've all been through things," she said finally. "Not like this." Dr. Williams replied, "Sarah, I know what PTSD looks like. My brother served 3 tours in Iraq. The way you reacted to that sound tonight, the techniques you use that aren't taught in medical school, the scars I've seen on your arms, I think you're a veteran." "Nah." Sarah's hands began to tremble slightly. For 3 years, she had managed to keep her past buried. She had built a new identity as Dr. Sarah Chen, emergency physician, and tried to forget about Petty Officer First Class Sarah Chen, Navy SEAL medic. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said. But her voice lacked conviction. "Dr." Williams leaned forward. "Sarah, there's nothing wrong with being a veteran, but there's something wrong with carrying that burden alone." Sarah stood up abruptly. "I need to go." But as she reached the door, Dr. Williams called after her. "Sarah, wait. I looked up your file again after tonight. There's a gap of 8 years between high school and medical school. That's a long time to be unaccounted for." Sarah stopped but didn't turn around. "I took time off to travel and work before starting college." "For 8 years?" Dr. Williams asked. "Sarah, please. I'm not trying to expose you or cause problems. I'm trying to help." Finally, Sarah turned around. Her carefully composed mask was cracking, and Dr. Williams could see the pain she had been hiding for so long. "You want to know the truth?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fine. I served 8 years as a Navy SEAL medic. I deployed to Afghanistan 4 times, and Iraq twice. I saved lives and I lost teammates, and I saw things that no one should ever have to see." The words came out in a rush, as if a dam had finally burst. "I was wounded on my last deployment. Not just physically, but mentally. I couldn't do the job anymore, so I got out and went to medical school, thinking I could start over and pretend the past 8 years never happened." Dr. Williams sat quietly, letting Sarah continue. "But you can't just erase that kind of experience," Sarah continued. "Every time I treat a trauma patient, I'm back there. Every loud noise makes me think about explosions. Every time someone doesn't make it, I think about the people I couldn't save overseas. And, and, Sarah slumped back into her chair, exhausted from finally saying the words she had kept hidden for so long. "I thought I could handle it on my own," she said. "I thought if I just worked hard enough and helped enough people here, I could make up for the ones I couldn't save there." Dr. Williams reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. "Sarah, you don't have to make up for anything, and you don't have to carry this alone." Riverside, 2000. "But if people here knew the truth about me, about what I've done, about the kind of missions I was involved in," Sarah trailed off. "They would respect you even more," Dr. Williams said firmly. "Sarah, you're one of the most skilled doctors I've ever worked with. The fact that you learned those skills, serving your country, doesn't diminish your abilities. It explains them." And then, over the next hour, Sarah slowly began to share more of her story. She talked about joining the Navy at 18, about the grueling training to become a SEAL, about the intense bond she had formed with her teammates. She talked about the medical training that had taught her to save lives under impossible conditions, and about the missions that she still couldn't discuss in detail. Most painfully, she talked about her last deployment, when an improvised explosive device had killed 2 of her teammates and wounded several others, including herself. She had spent 4 hours treating the wounded while under enemy fire, working with a piece of shrapnel in her own shoulder that she hadn't even realized was there until later. "That was when I knew I couldn't go back," Sarah said. "Not because I was afraid, but because I couldn't trust my judgment anymore." When you start questioning every decision in a life or death situation, you become a liability to your team. Dr. Williams listened to it all without judgment, asking gentle questions and offering support. By the time they left the break room, Sarah felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, even as she worried about what would happen next. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked as they walked to the parking garage together. "Nothing," Dr. Williams said. "This is your story to tell, when and if you're ready. But Sarah, I really think you should consider talking to someone professionally about the PTSD, and maybe think about whether hiding this part of yourself is really helping you heal." As they reached their cars, Dr. Williams turned to Sarah one more time. "For what it's worth, I think what you've done, both as a SEAL and as a doctor, is incredibly brave. You shouldn't have to hide that." Sarah drove home as the sun climbed higher in the sky, her mind racing with thoughts and emotions she had kept buried for years. For the first time since leaving the military, she wondered if it was time to stop running from her past and start facing it head-on. 2 months after her conversation with Dr. Williams, Sarah found herself standing outside the hospital's monthly staff meeting, her palms sweating despite the air conditioning. Dr. Williams had been patient, never pushing, but had gently suggested that Sarah might find healing in sharing her story with others. Today, she had finally agreed to speak to the entire medical staff about her background. The past 2 months had been a journey of self-discovery for Sarah. She had started seeing a therapist who specialized in military PTSD, and slowly began to understand that hiding her past was actually preventing her from fully healing. Dr. Williams had become not just a colleague but a trusted friend. Someone Sarah could talk to when the nightmares came, or when unexpected triggers brought back memories she thought she had buried. Sarah took a deep breath and walked into the conference room. It was packed with nearly every doctor, nurse, and medical technician in the hospital. Word had gotten out that Dr. Chen was going to give a special presentation, though no one except Dr. Williams knew what it was about. Dr. Martinez, who was moderating the meeting, smiled at her. Sarah walked to the front of the room, her hands trembling slightly. She had faced enemy fire without flinching, had performed surgery in combat zones while explosions shook the ground around her. But this felt like the most frightening thing she had ever done. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steadier than she expected. 3 months ago, I gave a presentation about trauma medicine, and several of you asked me where I had learned some of my techniques. I wasn't ready to answer that question then, but I am now. 1. The room was completely silent. Sarah could see curious faces staring back at her. People she had worked with for years, who thought they knew her. "My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and before I became a physician, I served 8 years in the United States Navy as a special operations medic. For those of you who aren't familiar with military terminology, I was what's known as a Navy SEAL." The silence in the room deepened. Several people's mouths dropped open in surprise. Dr. Rodriguez sat forward in his chair, suddenly understanding why Sarah's techniques had seemed so familiar. Sarah clicked to her first slide, which showed a photo of her in military uniform, looking young and determined. The contrast between that image and the quiet doctor they all knew was striking. "I joined the Navy when I was 18, Sarah continued. "I went through basic training, then medical training, and finally, the selection process to become a SEAL medic. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was also where I found my calling in emergency medicine." She clicked to the next slide, which showed a map of the Middle East with several regions highlighted. "Over 8 years, I deployed 6 times to Afghanistan and Iraq. My job was to provide medical support for special operations teams, often in situations where conventional medical evacuation wasn't possible." Dr. Kim, the young resident who had asked Sarah about staying calm during trauma situations, stared in amazement. Suddenly, Sarah's unflappable demeanor during the most chaotic emergency situations made perfect sense. The techniques I've shared with you, the approaches to trauma medicine that some of you have found unusual, were developed in environments where we had limited resources and unlimited stakes, Sarah explained. When you're treating someone in a combat zone, you don't have the luxury of extensive testing or second opinions. You have to make fast decisions with imperfect information, and you have to live with the consequences. Sarah's voice grew softer as she continued. I learned to perform complex medical procedures under extreme stress. I learned to triage patients when there were more wounded than I could possibly treat. And I learned that sometimes, no matter how skilled you are, or how hard you try, you can't save everyone. She clicked to another slide. This one showing a field hospital tent, similar to the one she had shown months earlier. But now, the audience understood the personal significance of the image. This is where I spent much of my deployment time, Sarah said. These field hospitals were where we treated not just American service members, but also coalition forces, local civilians, and sometimes even enemy combatants. Medicine in a war zone doesn't recognize politics or nationality. You treat whoever needs help. Dr. Williams, watching from the middle of the room, could see the emotional toll this was taking on Sarah, but she could also see something else. A sense of relief. As if Sarah was finally able to breathe fully after years of holding her breath. Sarah continued with her presentation, sharing sanitized versions of some of her experiences. She talked about treating multiple casualties from roadside bombs, about performing surgery in tents while mortar rounds exploded nearby, about the intense bonds formed with teammates who depended on each other for survival. The medical challenges were unlike anything you encounter in civilian practice, she explained. We saw traumatic injuries that would never occur outside of combat. We had to innovate constantly, to adapt procedures for field conditions, to make equipment work in ways it wasn't designed for. She clicked to a slide showing various pieces of military medical equipment. Much of what we use in civilian trauma medicine today was actually developed by military medics working under combat conditions. The techniques I've shared with you didn't come from textbooks, they came from necessity. As Sarah spoke, her colleagues began to understand not just her exceptional skills, but also some of the quirks they had noticed over the years. Her tendency to scan rooms when she entered them, her ability to work effectively during the most stressful situations, her knowledge of trauma patterns that seemed almost intuitive. But serving as a combat medic also came with costs, Sarah said, her voice becoming more personal. The constant stress, the responsibility for other people's lives, the things we witnessed. They leave marks that aren't always visible. She clicked to a slide that showed statistics about PTSD in military veterans. Many of us who served in combat zones struggle with post-traumatic stress. For years after leaving the military, I tried to pretend that part of my life had never happened. I thought I could start over completely and leave all of that behind. Sarah paused, looking around the room at her colleagues. But you can't really leave behind that kind of experience. It becomes part of who you are, for better and worse. The skills I learned in the military make me a better doctor, but the trauma I experienced also affects how I see the world. Dr. Martinez found himself thinking about all the times he had wondered about Sarah's background, about her unusual composure during emergencies, about the gaps in her personal history that she had never explained. 2 months ago, Sarah continued, I finally started getting help for the PTSD that I had been ignoring for years. I started talking to a therapist, started processing some of the experiences I had buried, and I realized that hiding my military service wasn't protecting me. It was preventing me from fully healing and from being authentic with people I care about. She looked directly at Dr. Williams, who smiled encouragingly. I'm sharing this with you tonight because I want you to understand where my medical knowledge comes from. And also because I want other veterans in our hospital community to know that they're not alone, Sarah said. Whether you're a staff member or a patient, if you've served in the military and you're struggling with the transition to civilian life, there are people who understand what you're going through. Sarah clicked to her final slide, which showed a photo of her current medical team at the hospital. When I left the military, I thought I was leaving behind my calling to serve others. But what I've learned is that medicine, whether in a combat zone or a civilian hospital, is all about the same thing. Being there for people in their most vulnerable moments and doing everything you can to help them. The room erupted in applause. It started slowly, with Dr. Rodriguez clapping, then built as other staff members joined in. People were standing up, some wiping tears from their eyes. Several colleagues who were also military veterans made their way to the front of the room. As the applause died down, hands shot up around the room. The questions came in a flood. About her training, about specific medical techniques, about the transition from military to civilian medicine. But underlying all the medical questions were deeper ones, about courage, about service, about healing from trauma. Dr. Kim raised her hand. Dr. Chen, when you said that experience teaches you to stay calm during trauma situations, you were talking about combat experience, weren't you? Sarah nodded. Yes. When you've treated gunshot wounds while under enemy fire, a busy emergency room feels manageable by comparison. But it's important to understand that the calm you see isn't because I don't feel the stress. It's because I've learned to function despite the stress. Dr. Rodriguez stood up. Dr. Chen, I served in Vietnam as a medic, and I want to thank you for sharing your story. I've always suspected you were military, but I never wanted to pry. Your skills and your demeanor, they're unmistakably military medical. The questions continued for another hour. Sarah answered them all with growing confidence, sharing not just the technical aspects of her experience, but also the emotional journey of transitioning from military to civilian life. As the meeting finally came to an end, people approached Sarah individually to thank her, to share their own stories, or simply to express their admiration. Several staff members who were struggling with their own PTSD or trauma asked for information about the therapy she had mentioned. Dr. Williams was one of the last people to approach her. How do you feel? She asked. Sarah took a deep breath. Exhausted, relieved, scared, but also free, I think. For the first time in years, I feel like I can be completely myself here. Good, Dr. Williams said. Because we need you to be yourself. Not just the skilled doctor part of yourself, but all of it. Your experience, your perspective, your strength. It makes our whole team better. As Sarah packed up her materials and prepared to leave, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few months. She was still the same person who had learned to save lives under impossible conditions. Still the same person who carried the weight of difficult experiences. But now she was also someone who had found the courage to be vulnerable, to ask for help, to share her truth with others. The nightmares hadn't completely gone away, and probably never would. The hypervigilance and the occasional flashbacks were still part of her reality. But for the first time since leaving the military, Sarah felt like she was healing rather than just surviving. As she walked out to her car, Sarah's phone buzzed with text messages from colleagues thanking her for her presentation, offering support, or asking follow-up questions. But the message that meant the most came from Dr. Kim. Dr. Chen, thank you for showing us that strength isn't about being fearless. It's about facing your fears and serving others anyway. Sarah smiled as she read it. After years of hiding who she really was, she had finally found the courage to let people see her completely, wounded but strong, scarred but healing, quiet about her past but ready to face her future. The room had indeed frozen when she revealed her battlefield history, but not out of judgment or fear. It had frozen out of respect, understanding, and recognition of a kind of service and sacrifice that most people would never fully comprehend. For the first time in years, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she belonged.